Wichita, Kansas. The tarmac was still wet from the morning rain. Vanessa Kirkland stood at the base of her private jet's stairs, invoice in hand, jaw tight. "I'm not paying this," she said, sliding the paper back across the toolbox toward Nathaniel Bishop. He didn't argue. He folded the airworthiness, released the one signature that made this jet legal to fly, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Above them, the pilot cut the engine. Headset came off. Then, another engine died. Then another. Vanessa turned, searching for someone to blame, and found only silence, and 30 feet of tarmac between her and every man who wouldn't fly her anywhere. Before you keep watching, ask yourself something. If you did the work, and they refused to pay you for it, would you still be the one to sign the paper that let them fly safely? Hold on to that answer. It matters later. 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning that started like every other one, Nathaniel Bishop stood in the open mouth of a private hangar at Cessna Aviation Field, coffee going cold on a workbench behind him, watching his daughter climb into the passenger seat of his truck. "Seatbelt," he said, before she could ask why. Lily Bishop was 9 years old, all elbows and questions, and she buckled the belt without being told twice. "Are you fixing a plane today?" "Somebody's plane," Nate said. "Every day it's somebody's plane." He dropped her at school, watched her disappear through the double doors with her backpack bouncing against one shoulder, and drove back to the hangar the way he had for 6 years now. Alone, quiet, and on time. Nate had built a reputation in Wichita that outsized his paycheck. Mechanics twice his age deferred to him. Pilots requested him by name before a flight, the way some travelers request a particular seat, out of habit and superstition both. None of it showed on the outside. He wore the same gray coveralls as every other line mechanic at the airfield, drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it, kept his toolbox organized the way his father had taught him 30 years earlier, and never once mentioned that he used to sit in rooms where men decided what made an aircraft safe enough to sell to the public. That version of his life lived in a single box in his garage, unopened for years. He preferred it that way. That morning, Kirkland Dynamics called ahead of schedule. Their Gulfstream needed servicing before an afternoon flight to Chicago. Something about a hydraulic warning light the crew wanted cleared before takeoff. The ground crew supervisor relayed the request the way he relayed most requests from that account, with a faint note of caution in his voice, because Kirkland Dynamics clients tended to arrive expecting speed over process. Vanessa Kirkland arrived 20 minutes after her plane did, dressed like she had somewhere more important to be, which she did. She was 35, sharp-eyed, and carried herself like a woman used to rooms going quiet when she walked in. She'd inherited the company from her father 2 years earlier and had spent every day since proving, to a board that watched her closely, that inheriting it and running it were two different things entirely. "You're the mechanic," she said, not quite a question. "I'm the mechanic," Nate said, already halfway under the fuselage panel with a flashlight between his teeth. She checked her watch. "I need this plane in the air by 2. Nate didn't look up. "You'll have an answer by noon." What he found by noon wasn't a warning light. It was a hydraulic line worn thin enough to fail mid-flight. The kind of problem that didn't show up on a standard checklist unless someone knew exactly where to look, and knew to look at all. He wrote up the finding, priced the repair, and handed the paperwork to Vanessa's assistant instead of Vanessa herself, because Vanessa was on a call with her legal team and didn't have time for mechanics. $4,100. The assistant read aloud, frowning at the total. For a hose that would have put your boss in a cornfield somewhere over Missouri," Nate said, not unkindly. "Your call." Vanessa took the report without reading past the total. Beside her, a man in a gray suit leaned in and murmured something Nate couldn't hear. The man was Marcus Doyle, chief of staff to Vanessa's father for 11 years before the handoff, and unofficially still the person who signed off on every dollar the company spent on maintenance, insurance, and anything else that touched an aircraft. "These small operations inflate their numbers," Doyle said quietly, close enough to her ear that it read as advice rather than interference. "They know you're in a hurry." Vanessa didn't answer him directly. She looked at Nate instead, weighing him the way she weighed vendors, contractors, and anyone else asking for money. "Can you do it faster?" "I have a 2 o'clock. I can do it right," Nate said. "Or I can do it fast. I don't do both on hydraulics." She held his gaze a second longer than the conversation required, then turned and walked back toward the terminal without another word, heels sharp against the tarmac. Nate finished the repair by 1:30, tested the line twice, and signed the airworthiness release himself, the way he always did, plainly without ceremony, in the same signature he'd used for 20 years on every job that carried his name. He submitted the invoice to Kirkland Dynamics' accounting office that afternoon. Standard net 15 terms. Nothing unusual. Nothing he hadn't done 100 times before with other clients who paid without complaint. What was unusual was the response 2 days later. A curt email stating the invoice was under review pending budget confirmation. Nate had seen delayed payments before, the ordinary kind. The kind that came from a distracted accounting department or a slow-moving approval chain. He hadn't seen one worded quite this deliberately. He didn't chase it. He had a mortgage payment due and a daughter who needed new shoes, but chasing money made him feel like the men who used to chase him for favors back when his name meant something in boardrooms, and he'd left that version of himself behind on purpose, years ago, for reasons that still felt right, even on the hard days. At the hangar, Frank Salas was doing something he rarely did during a slow afternoon. Reading. He was Kirkland Dynamics' chief pilot, 61 years old, 38 of those years spent in a cockpit, and he was flipping through an old training binder because a younger first officer had asked him a question about hydraulic failure procedures that morning, and Frank wanted to get the answer exactly right, instead of guessing at it. The binder was decades old. A compilation of safety bulletins every commercial pilot trained in the Midwest had studied at some point, whether they remembered the specifics or not. Frank had read this particular bulletin 100 times over the course of his career. He had never once looked closely at the name printed at the bottom of the page. N. Bishop, Chief Structural Engineer, Halloran Aerospace. Frank read it again. Slower this time, the way a person rereads something they're afraid to have understood correctly. Then he set the binder down on the workbench and walked out to the tarmac, where Nate was closing up a toolbox for the evening, and stood there for a moment without saying anything at all. "You wrote the hydraulic failure bulletin," Frank finally said. "The one every pilot in this state trained on for the last 15 years. Nate latched the toolbox shut. "A long time ago. You were an engineer. A real one. Not just." Frank gestured vaguely at the coveralls, at the toolbox, at everything around them. "I still am one," Nate said. "I just don't sit in an office anymore." Frank didn't push further, though he wanted to. He wanted to ask why a man who'd once decided how commercial aircraft were built now worked a line mechanic shift for a fraction of what he used to make. But something in Nate's face told him this wasn't a door that opened twice, and his own contract with Kirkland Dynamics had a clause about staying out of company business that had nothing to do with flying. He kept quiet. It cost him something to do it, and he suspected it would cost him more later. Nate drove home that evening without mentioning any of it to anyone. When Lily asked why he seemed tired, he told her it had been a long day, which was true in ways she didn't need to understand yet. "You could ask them to pay you," she said, with the blunt logic of a 9-year-old who hadn't yet learned that fairness and payment weren't always the same thing. "You did the work." "I did ask," Nate said. "Sometimes asking isn't enough." Lily considered this over a bite of dinner. "Then what is?" Nate didn't have an answer for her that night. He only had one, quietly, for himself, turned over long after she'd gone to bed. "I don't need her to think I'm good at this. I need her to pay for what I already did." That week, Nate kept the hangar running the way he always had, checking fuel lines before dawn, patching a cracked wingtip light for a crop duster pilot who paid in cash and gratitude in roughly equal measure, coming home in time to help Lily with a book report about the water cycle that she insisted on illustrating herself, badly, and with enormous pride. "Is it good?" she asked, holding up a drawing of a cloud that looked more like a fist than anything resembling weather. "It's perfect," Nate said, and meant it, because some things a father says are true regardless of the drawing in front of him. He didn't tell her about the invoice. He didn't tell her the mortgage notice had arrived with a red stamp on it this time, 30 days past due, second notice, the kind of letter that made a grown man's stomach drop before he'd even opened the envelope fully. He folded that letter into a kitchen drawer the way he folded most things that frightened him, carefully and out of sight, as if hiding the paper might buy him a few more days of pretending. Across town, in a glass office on the top floor of the Kirkland Dynamics building, Vanessa reviewed a stack of maintenance invoices with Marcus Doyle standing at her shoulder, the way he had stood at her father's shoulder for over a decade before that. "The Bishop invoice again," Doyle said, tapping the page with one finger. "I'd hold it another cycle. Cash flows tight this quarter with the merger costs mounting the way they are." "Is it tight?" Vanessa asked. She hadn't seen the merger figures herself in weeks. Doyle handled that reporting the way he'd handled her father's finances for 11 years before her father stepped back and handed the company to her with a warning that had stuck. "Keep Marcus close. He knows where everything lives." "Tighter than you'd think," Doyle said, closing the folder before she could look too long at the numbers beneath the summary page. "I'll manage it. That's what I'm here for." Vanessa signed off without further comment. The way she'd signed off on 100 things Doyle brought her, because trusting Doyle had never once cost her anything before, or so she believed, because she had never had a reason to check. Still, something small caught in her afterward, a detail she couldn't quite name or dismiss. The mechanic hadn't argued about the price. He hadn't padded the estimate, or acted wounded when she questioned it, or tried to charm her into paying faster. He'd simply told her the truth and let her decide what to do with it. Most people who wanted her money didn't operate that way, and the ones who did usually wanted something else from her too. She thought about it again that night, alone in an apartment that looked more like a hotel room than a home, all clean lines and no photographs, and told herself it didn't matter. A hose was a hose, a mechanic was a mechanic. She had a merger to close and a board that expected results, not sentiment, and sentiment had never once helped her hit a quarterly number. 2 days later, her assistant mentioned, almost in passing, that the Chicago trip had gone smoothly. No hydraulic warnings, no delays, no cornfields in Missouri. It had worked exactly the way Nate said it would. Vanessa noted that fact and set it aside, because noting it fully would have meant admitting she owed the man something, and admitting that wasn't part of how she'd learned to operate, in business or anywhere else. 3 weeks in, Vanessa had a board meeting in Denver that couldn't move. The kind of meeting where a missed connection cost more than the hotel would, and where every director in the room would notice if the company's own CEO showed up late to discuss the very merger she was championing. She had her assistant confirm the jet for 6 that morning. Nate got the call at 5:40. He was already awake. Lily had a cold and had woken twice in the night, and he'd spent an hour at her bedside with a cool cloth and a low voice before finally drifting off himself. He answered on the second ring. "The Kirkland jet's scheduled for 0600, the ground crew supervisor told him. "You signed off the hydraulic repair 3 weeks back. I need your release on file before Frank starts the pre-flight." Nate looked across the kitchen at the invoice folder still sitting on the quaid. Unpaid for 21 days now, past any terms he'd ever extended anyone in 15 years of running his own line of work. "I can't release that aircraft," he said. There was a pause on the line. "Come again?" "The repair's sound. The aircraft's safe to fly, mechanically. But the release isn't just a technical signature. It's my professional certification that the work was completed and accepted under proper terms. It hasn't been accepted. It hasn't been paid for. I can't put my name on a document saying otherwise, and you wouldn't want me to." "Not really. That's going to ground her flight, Nate." "I know," Nate said, and he did know, and it cost him to say it, because grounding a client's flight wasn't something he did lightly, not with a mortgage notice sitting in his kitchen drawer, and a daughter with a cold asleep down the hall. But there were rules that existed for reasons bigger than any one invoice. Rules he'd helped write once, long ago, in a different life, and he'd spent his whole career believing in exactly those reasons whether they were convenient for him or not. Frank got the call 40 minutes later, standing on the tarmac with his coffee going cold in the same way Nate's had 3 weeks before, in the same gray morning light. He listened without interrupting, said nothing for a moment after the supervisor finished, and then walked to the cockpit and told his first officer to power down the second engine before it had fully spun up. Vanessa arrived at 5:50 to find her plane silent and her chief pilot standing beside it with his arms crossed, an unreadable expression on a face she'd trusted with her life more times than she could count. "We have a documentation issue," Frank said. "The airworthiness release for the hydraulic repair was never finalized." "Finalize it," Vanessa said, checking her watch again, the gesture sharper this time. "Now." I have a room full of directors waiting. That's not how it works, Miss Kirkland. The release wasn't withheld because of paperwork. It was withheld because the invoice hasn't been paid. Vanessa's face went still in the particular way it did when she was furious and unwilling to show it in front of a ground crew. This is extortion. It's the law, Frank said quietly, meeting her eyes without flinching. I don't love it either. I've got somewhere to be too, technically, but I'm not putting this plane in the air without his signature, and neither is anyone else on this field, and if I'm honest with you, I don't think I'd want them to. Word moved through the airfield the way it always did, not through announcements, but through the particular silence of men who worked with their hands and traded information in short sentences while doing so. By that afternoon, 3 other pilots contracted through the regional charter network, men who flew for oil executives and hospital boards, and one very nervous state senator up for re-election had heard some version of the story. A private jet grounded over an unpaid invoice wasn't remarkable on its own. Airlines and charters dealt with billing disputes constantly. What was remarkable was the name attached to the repair. One of them, a retired Air Force major named Wallace Hutt, who now flew corporate charters out of Kansas City, called an old friend from flight school to confirm what he thought he remembered. Bishop, he said, Nathaniel Bishop, wrote that hydraulic bulletin we all trained on back in the day. That's really him? Working a line at a private field in Wichita? That's him, the friend confirmed. Has been for years, from what I hear. Nobody made a thing of it. He never did either. And Kirkland's not paying him? Not yet. Hutt didn't take it personally. He'd never met Vanessa Kirkland, and had no particular grudge against her company. But he knew what it meant when a company stiffed the kind of man whose name he'd studied out of a binder for a licensing exam 20 years earlier, back when Hutt was young enough to think the rules existed only to be memorized rather than lived by. He made a decision that had nothing to do with loyalty to Nate personally, and everything to do with a code he'd carried since flight school. You didn't fly on the back of somebody else's unpaid work, not if you had a choice in the matter. He declined a scheduled charter for a Kirkland Dynamics executive that same week, citing documentation concerns of his own. So did 2 other pilots by Friday, each one making the same quiet calculation on their own terms. Vanessa found out about the pattern only when her assistant flagged 3 separate cancellations in a single week, all citing vague concerns that didn't add up to a clear explanation on paper. She drove to the hangar herself that evening, without Doyle, without an assistant. In a car she rarely drove because it didn't have a driver attached to it, and she wanted, for reasons she hadn't fully examined, to arrive alone this time. Nate was closing the hangar for the night when her headlights swept across the tarmac. She got out, arms crossed against the evening chill, and found him exactly where she'd found him 3 weeks earlier, steady, unhurried, unimpressed by her presence, in a way almost nobody in her professional life managed to be. You're costing me business, she said, without preamble. I'm doing my job, Nate said. The same one I did 3 weeks ago. For the same amount of money you still haven't paid me. She opened her mouth to answer and then stopped, because across the tarmac, at the edge of the hangar's light, stood a small girl in a school jacket, waiting patiently on an overturned bucket with a coloring book balanced on her knees, the way children wait when they've learned that waiting is simply part of loving someone who works with his hands for a living. Vanessa looked at her for a long moment. Something in her chest that she usually kept locked shifted slightly, like a door someone had forgotten to bolt properly. That's your daughter, she said, quieter than before. That's my daughter, Nate said. Vanessa didn't say anything else. She got back in her car and drove away, and for the first time since this began, she didn't look angry when she left. She looked, instead, like a woman doing arithmetic she didn't like the answer to. Frank Salas hadn't slept well in 4 days. It wasn't the grounded jet, or the cancellations, or even the calls from other pilots asking him quietly whether the rumors were true. It was the folder in his desk drawer at the hangar office, the one he'd found 18 months earlier while archiving old maintenance budgets, and never quite managed to forget no matter how many times he told himself it wasn't his to worry about. He'd told himself at the time it wasn't his business. He told himself the same thing every day since, most mornings without much difficulty. But watching a man who'd once shaped the safety standards of an entire industry get stonewalled over $4,000 had a way of rearranging what counted as somebody's business, and Frank found standing in his kitchen at 5 in the morning with the folder in his hands, that he couldn't tell himself the old story anymore. On Thursday morning, he asked for 15 minutes with Vanessa. He placed the folder on her desk without preamble. "I found this by accident, going through old budget archives about 18 months back. I sat on it because I didn't think it was mine to raise. I don't think that anymore." Vanessa opened it. Line items. Maintenance fund allocations going back 2 years, cross-referenced against actual invoices paid across that same window. The numbers didn't match, not by a small margin easily explained by rounding or timing, but by hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled through a series of vendor accounts that all traced back to approvals signed by one person, over and over, quarter after quarter. "Marcus Doyle. He's been skimming the maintenance fund," Frank said. "Small enough each time that nobody outside the department would notice, especially not someone who trusted the person doing the reporting. But there's an outside audit scheduled for next month, the one tied to the merger. If Bishop's invoice got paid and logged properly, it would have shown the maintenance fund had money it shouldn't have been missing, because your mechanic doesn't inflate numbers, and an honest invoice next to 2 years of dishonest ones would have stood out like a lit window at midnight. Doyle needed it buried, not because of the amount, because of what paying it honestly would have revealed underneath it. Vanessa read the folder twice, and somewhere in the second read, the version of Marcus Doyle she'd trusted for 11 years quietly came apart in her hands, page by page, number by number. She confronted him that afternoon, in his office, door closed, blinds drawn without either of them saying why. He tried the explanations first, reclassifications, timing differences, complicated accounting nobody outside the department would fully understand. And then, when she laid the actual numbers across his desk in her father's old handwriting style, the same clipped, patient way her father used to corner people who'd underestimated him, Doyle stopped explaining and started sweating in earnest. "Your father trusted me," he said, as if that settled anything at all. "My father isn't running this company," Vanessa said. "I am, and I just found out I've spent 3 weeks treating an honest man like a con artist to protect a thief who's been robbing this company since before I had the title to stop him." She left his office without waiting for a response, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something closer to shame than anger, not because she'd been deceived, but because she'd been so willing to believe the worst about the one person in this entire situation who'd never once lied to her, not even when the truth cost him money he badly needed. By the following week, what had started as 3 canceled charters became something closer to an industry-wide reckoning. News of the buried maintenance funds reached Kirkland Dynamics board before Vanessa had finished drafting a statement about it, carried by a director who happened to golf with one of the pilots who'd declined a charter, and reached the regional pilots network even faster, traveling the way these things always traveled, quietly, person to person, until it wasn't quiet anymore at all. 11 pilots across 4 states declined Kirkland Dynamics charters that week, some citing the documentation issue directly, others simply going silent on scheduling requests in a way that said everything without saying anything. 2 corporate partners called Vanessa personally, asking pointed questions about oversight and internal audits that she couldn't fully answer yet. A local business reporter, tipped off by someone nobody could later identify, began asking questions about a grounded jet and an unpaid mechanic in Wichita, questions that were only going to get sharper the longer they went unanswered. Vanessa didn't wait for the story to run before she acted. She drove to the hangar on a Tuesday morning with a company check in hand and no assistant, no lawyer, no prepared statement, just herself, walking across the same tarmac where this had started 3 weeks earlier, past a small crowd of mechanics and 2 off-duty pilots who'd come simply to see how this ended, word having spread that something was finally happening. Nate was under the fuselage of a different aircraft entirely when she found him, and he didn't come out right away, finishing the bolt he was tightening, because half-finished work wasn't something he left behind, even for moments like this one. Vanessa waited without checking her watch, which was its own kind of change. When he finally stood, wiping his hands on a rag, she held out the check, full amount, paid in advance for good measure, an apology written into the number itself in a way words alone couldn't have managed. "I was wrong," she said, loud enough for the small crowd to hear, because an apology said quietly to save face wasn't the kind that meant anything to a man like this. About the invoice. About you. I let someone I trusted convince me you were the problem, when you were the only honest thing in this entire situation from the very first day." Nate took the check, folded it once, and put it in his breast pocket without looking at the number written on it. "Apologies not why I did any of this," he said. "I did it because a signature means something, or it doesn't mean anything at all. Doesn't matter whose name is on it or how much money is riding on it. You just made mine mean something again, and that's worth more to me than the check." He walked to his toolbox, retrieved the airworthiness release he'd carried folded in his jacket pocket for 3 weeks, and signed it there on the tarmac, in front of everyone watching, the same plain signature he'd used for 20 years, across every job that had ever carried his name. Frank Salas, watching from the cockpit stairs with his arms loosely crossed, exhaled for what felt like the first time in a month, the particular relief of a man who'd finally watched the right thing happen without having to force it. Marcus Doyle was terminated within the week, and referred to federal investigators handling financial oversight for the merger, a fact that made 3 paragraphs of the local business section and considerably more conversation in the hangar break room, where mechanics who'd never once met the man now had opinions about him anyway. Vanessa spent the following days doing something she rarely did, sitting still with a decision instead of rushing past it toward the next one. She called Nate on a Thursday afternoon, not through an assistant, and asked if he'd come to her office. "Not about the plane," she told him. "About something else." He came after his shift, still in coveralls because he hadn't wanted to make an occasion of it, and sat across from her in a room built to intimidate people who weren't him, in a chair that had made grown executives fidget in the past. "Frank told me what you used to do," she said. "Before all this, I want to hear it from you, not from him, and not from an old binder somebody dug out of a filing cabinet." Nate considered the request for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the desk in front of him, then gave her the truth plainly, the way he gave everyone the truth, without softening it and without asking for sympathy along the way. "I was cheating Euro at Halloran Aerospace. 14 years. I wrote safety standards half this industry still trains on. Sat in rooms with men who thought their opinions mattered more than the physics did. Then my wife died, and I looked at the life I had. Meetings, travel, a daughter who barely knew me some weeks, and I understood I'd built a career instead of a family, and I didn't want to keep doing that, not for one more year, no matter what it cost me to walk away." "So you became a mechanic." "I became a father who happens to be very good at fixing airplanes," Nate said. "The title never mattered to me the way people assume it should. What I built with my hands still had to be right, whether I was signing a bulletin that would train a generation of pilots, or a repair ticket for a hose nobody would ever think twice about." Vanessa sat with that for a long moment, the kind of silence that would have felt awkward with almost anyone else in her professional life and didn't feel that way with him, not even a little. "I judged you the day I met you," she finally said. "I decided what you were worth before I knew anything real about you, based on nothing but a coverall and an invoice. That's not a mistake I make often, not in business. I don't like that I made it with you, of all people." "You corrected it," Nate said. "Most people don't bother. Once they've already decided, they just find a way to make the first impression true, no matter what comes after it." "Does it bother you?" she asked. "That I still don't fully understand what you gave up to end up in a hangar in Wichita?" "It used to," Nate said. "For a long time, actually. Then I watched my daughter learn to read, and realized I'd have missed it if I'd stayed. That trade still feels right to me, even on the days the mortgage doesn't." Neither of them said anything else for a while. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind two people fall into when they've run out of things that need explaining and haven't yet found a reason to leave the room, content, for the moment, simply to sit in it together. Vanessa offered him the position of senior technical advisor to Kirkland Dynamics the following week, full oversight on maintenance standards across the fleet, a salary that would have embarrassed his old title at Halloran, and, more importantly to her, a direct line to the board so no one could ever bury an invoice, or a person, the way Doyle had for years without anyone noticing. Nate didn't answer right away. He thought about Lily, about stability, about a mortgage notice he could finally close a drawer on for good instead of hiding it and hoping, and about whether taking the job meant becoming, again, the man he'd deliberately walked away from years earlier, the one who'd missed dinners and school plays in exchange for a title that hadn't kept his wife alive, or made the missing easier to bear afterward. One condition, he told her, setting the offer letter down without signing it yet. I don't want this because you're sorry. Sorry fades. I want it because you actually need someone in that building who won't tell you what you want to hear just to keep his job. That's the only reason I'm offering it, Vanessa said, and she meant it in a way that surprised her slightly, the words coming easier than she'd expected. I've had enough people around me who specialize in telling me what I want to hear. Look where that got the maintenance fund. He accepted 2 days later, on a Friday afternoon, at the hangar, with Lily present because there was nowhere else for her to be after school, and no one left in his life he needed to hide her from. Not anymore. Frank had come by that afternoon too, ostensibly to check a maintenance log, though everyone in the hangar understood he'd really come to watch the ending of something he'd played a quiet part in starting. He shook Nate's hand a beat longer than usual. Figured you'd end up back where you belonged eventually, he said. Didn't figure it would take a grounded jet to get you there. Didn't figure it either, Nate admitted. But I'm not sorry it did. Vanessa crouched down to the girl's level without being asked, the way people do when they've decided, quietly and without announcement, that someone matters enough to meet at their height instead of talking down at them. Your dad fixed my plane, she said. Did you know that? He fixes everybody's plane, Lily said. Matter of fact, coloring book open on her knees, crayon paused mid-stroke. That's his job. It is, Vanessa said, and something in her voice caught slightly, in a way she didn't try particularly hard to hide. It's a good one, maybe the most important one at this whole airfield, even if most people don't think about it that way. Frank says Daddy could fix anything, Lily offered, returning to her coloring, even things that aren't planes. Frank, standing a short distance off, pretending not to listen, allowed himself something he hadn't felt in weeks. The particular relief of having done the harder right thing instead of the easier quiet one, and watching it land exactly where it needed to. 6 months later, the hangar at Cessna Aviation Field looked mostly the same, except for the new sign near the office door that read Kirkland Dynamics Maintenance Standards, and the fact that pilots from 3 states now called ahead just to ask whether Nathaniel Bishop had personally signed off on a given aircraft before they'd agree to fly it, a small habit that had become, without anyone officially deciding it should, an industry shorthand for safety itself. Vanessa ran the company differently now. Board meetings opened with safety reports before they opened with quarterly earnings, a small change that had cost the company nothing on paper and had, according to Frank, changed everything about how the mechanics on the ground felt about the woman upstairs, the sense that someone up there was finally looking down and actually seeing them. Marcus Doyle's case moved slowly through federal court, the way these cases always did, and Vanessa checked on its progress the way a person checks a wound that's mostly healed, occasionally, and without much feeling left in it one way or another. On a Friday evening in late autumn, the sky over the airfield turned the particular orange that only happens for about 10 minutes at a time, right at the edge of dusk, and Lily ran across the tarmac, chasing a kite that kept refusing to catch the wind, laughing anyway, in the way children do when the trying matters more than the catching ever could. Nate stood near the hangar doors, watching her, a mug of coffee cooling in his hand the way it always seemed to be lately, one more thing he never quite got around to finishing. Vanessa came to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and neither of them moved away from it. I used to think I had this whole life figured out, she said, watching Lily fail to catch the kite for the 3rd time in a row. Then, a mechanic wouldn't sign a piece of paper, and none of it made sense the same way again. Not the company, not my father's advice, not any of it. I used to think I'd said goodbye to a version of myself I didn't want back, Nate said. Turns out I just needed the right reason to let him back in, on my own terms this time, not his. Are you glad you did? Nate considered the question the way he considered most things, slowly and honestly. Ask me again once I've survived a full year of board meetings. Vanessa laughed, a short, unguarded sound that surprised her more than it surprised him. Lily finally caught the kite, tumbling into the grass with it, shrieking with the specific joy of a 9-year-old who has just won something enormous and entirely temporary. Neither adult moved to help her up right away. They just watched. The kite bent and grass-stained and triumphant in her small hands, and for a while, that was enough for both of them. Neither of them had been looking, but somehow they had found exactly what they needed.